The longest and most distressing process I've ever experienced in my practice was a murder. There appeared to be nearly 70 wounds. Hello friends, my name is Boris. I'm a forensic medical expert. I've been working for a little over 23 years, almost a quarter of a century. A forensic medical expert is a person with a higher medical education. So yes, a doctor who after graduating from medical school receives additional education and extra specialization by completing an internship in forensic medicine. Wherever any medical knowledge is needed to serve the needs of jurisprudence or law enforcement, that's where forensic medical experts work. We receive all those cases that occurred either outside the home in medical institutions, or cases of sudden death, unexpected death, rapid death, suspicious death that may indicate violent death, or any death that raises questions for law enforcement agencies. We are now in the autopsy room of the Odisha Bureau of Forensic Medical Examination. In everyday language, this is usually called the forensic morgue. This is where bodies are examined and the cause of death is determined. Well, here in front of us is the set that's mainly used, our most frequently used tool. You could say the symbol of our profession. This is the large autopsy knife, also known as the amputation knife. Almost all incisions of soft tissues that need to be made during an autopsy are done with this knife. When you need to cut something denser than soft tissues, from skin to ribs, you use this knife here. It's called a rib knife. It has a thicker, stronger blade and a blunter or less sharp angle, which allows it to cut through various hard objects. It won't get dull from this, unlike the large sectional knife. Let's move on to the ladle then, also known as the dipper or the spoon. During research, it's very often, almost always necessary to take samples of liquid substances, liquid components. We always take blood samples, test blood for alcohol. If there is urine, we test urine for alcohol. Sometimes we have to examine blood for blood type and so on. This little spoon scoop is used for all these types of sampling. Basically, this is a blade saw used for cutting bone tissue where necessary. It's always needed when examining the cranial cavity in order to actually access the cavity in the brain. And if necessary, the same saw is used to cut out bone fragments that need to be studied more closely in laboratory conditions. A headrest, that is, when a body is placed on the autopsy table. In order to make it easier to work with the cranial cavity, this wooden headrest is placed under the head. It's a small block with a semicircular cutout. The head is elevated and access to the cranial cavity becomes more convenient. The duration of an autopsy depends greatly on two factors: the complexity of the case and, of course, the competence and experience of the forensic expert performing it. Perhaps in this regard, the longest and most difficult process I had in my practice was a murder case. In the early 2000s, when there was a gang shootout at the Caravella bar, as far as I remember, on French Boulevard, and a table in the restaurant was shot up with automatic weapons. So to speak, a competing bank with a gang. Like in Tarantino movies or old American gangster action films. And in the body that I got to examine, there were almost 70 holes. Some holes were entry wounds, others exit wounds, and some were different altogether. These were caused by secondary projectiles, such as flying fragments and splinters. I entered the autopsy room, as far as I remember, around 10 in the morning and left at about, let's say, 10 in the evening. During an autopsy, the body's external appearance is described first. The external examination provides a detailed description, including body length, clothing, condition, color, style, and any external injuries. And only after that, actually, we go inside and examine the contents of the cavities and everything else that's necessary, depending on the nature of the case. During this exam, each organ is first described in situ, its appearance, proper formation, and correct placement. After that, it is removed, its dimensions are measured, the organ is weighed on scales, then it is dissected, and its internal structure is examined, and samples are taken for laboratory analysis. In the 90s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were quite a lot of various amusing and interesting findings. First of all, of course, it's drugs. Back then, it was actually a trend to hide things in the rectum, even carrying a loaded insulin syringe there, as a kind of secret stash spot. With such a superficial inspection, law enforcement officers most likely won't find it. What I remember most is probably a funny, ridiculous incident that happened on the grounds of a psychiatric hospital. It was a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. The students found a severed mammary gland, a woman's breast, lying on the grass on the lawn. And during the inspection of the place where it was found, we discovered a burial site in which several dozen breasts were found. Of varying degrees, so to speak, of freshness, age, different sizes, shapes, and so on. This situation, this story, caused panic among all law enforcement agencies. Finding something like this at a psychiatric hospital usually leads people to assume it's a maniac. They realized first there aren't many missing women. Also, if all the breasts are here, where is everything else? It later turned out that this was biomaterial. Next to the Odessa Psychiatric Hospital, there is an oncology hospital, an oncology dispensary, where breast surgery is probably one of the most common procedures. And at some point, some lazy junior medical staff thought it was appropriate to just bury a bag of surgical waste over the fence at the neighbor's place. In some ways, it even shook our worldview. Is it really possible for something like this to happen in our city? Thank God it turned out to be impossible. It's quite a casuistic, unique case that certainly deserves attention and study. The hanging or strangulation by car parts occurred as a result of an accident. The driver of the car, an ordinary old Zhigulionok, stopped and got out of the car. It happened in winter. The driver stepped onto the ground, slipped, and fell, hitting his neck in the gap between the windshield pillar and the driver's door glass, right? And that was the cause of his death. It was the compression of the neck organs between these parts of the car. Some people treat hanging rather lightly. On one hand, there are demonstrative individuals who attempt to hang themselves in order to manipulate their family and loved ones. There are people who use asphyxiation as part of certain erotic games. Sometimes these cases result in death, completely unexpected for those involved. Because once hanging has occurred, that is, when the noose has tightened around the neck or the neck is compressed, as we see in this case, by some objects. The first thing that happens to a person is that they lose the ability to make purposeful, coordinated movements. It is impossible to free oneself from the noose once hanging has already begun, and this turns out to be an unpleasant surprise and leads to the death of those people who, in general, did not intend to end the process so decisively. As a rule, when it comes to forensic medicine or forensic experts, most ordinary people, civilians, usually think only about death, corpses, and autopsies. But in reality, that's far from the main part of our work. That is, if we talk about the number of examinations performed, the nerves spent, the time, and so on, then in first place, absolutely in first place, will be our work with living people. This is the activity that civilians usually call documenting injuries. Officially, this is called forensic medical examination of living persons. From what I remember, sometimes it happens. This, of course, is primarily about attempts to falsify bodily injuries, attempts to draw bruises on themselves. That also happens when a person needs these bodily injuries to put some kind of pressure on another person who supposedly caused them. So people try to falsify them somehow, and sometimes people try to inflict a bodily injury right on the spot. Well, for example, I had a very funny case when a woman who was supposedly a victim of rape and had no signs of rape on her body. At night, when the police officers were distracted, she suggested that I quickly have intercourse with her so that she would reliably have those very signs. Of course, I didn't find this idea appealing, although I have to say that this kind of bribe is quite unique. I refrained from carrying out this cunning plan.
Are you going to the crime scene?
Examining the body where it was found is most common, but besides that, there can also be exhumations, investigative experiments, reconstruction of the scene, the circumstances of the incident, and so on. Of course, the time between death and autopsy can vary a lot. Usually the longest cases are archaeological excavations. Odessa in this sense may not have been involved to the same extent as Belarus, but it also saw a lot of fighting during World War I. And quite often we find some bone remains, some fragments from those times, and sometimes even earlier. The remains of those who died during the Holocaust, yes, victims, and sometimes even earlier remains from Jewish pogroms, yes, these remains are recovered and sent to us. And our task in this case is at least to determine which era they belong to, which part of the 20th century, yes. So that at the very least we can rule out the assumption that this is a recent crime, that it's not some criminal murder from 10 or 5 years ago, that it really has been a century or half a century. If we're not talking about buried bodies, but about bodies that are exposed, not buried, then probably my oldest case in this regard was about half a year. When the neighbors noticed that their elderly neighbor hadn't gone out for bread for about half a year, they reported it. So again, back then it was still the police and a group gathered. The investigator, detectives, and expert witnesses, and a locksmith from the housing office, and they started to open the door to this elderly woman's apartment. It felt like we had opened the door to a sauna steam room. A thick wave of heat came out from there, a dense wave of heat. And when we actually walked through that dense wave of heat, we found the kitchen that the front door led to, the body of the apartment owner lying on the floor, and the gas stove burning. A small torch was burning on that burner, and on that burning flame were the remains of a kettle. Actually, all that was left of the kettle was a rim with a burnt-out bottom, and separately lying around were the spout and the handle from the kettle. We should be grateful that during those 6 months the gas was never turned off. Yes, because if it had gone out and then the gas started flowing again, well, yes, that could have been a tragedy. Not even just a fire, the whole house could have exploded. Actually, the body didn't even look terrible at that point. Yes, so in the 6 months that the body spent in the dry heat, it became completely mummified and the corpse looked just like a mummy. That is, all the once soft tissues had completely dried out, and the bones were so light and dry that you could pick them up with one hand and barely feel their weight. All the water had left the body, leaving behind these dry, brittle remains. Plus, usually it's never boring. There are lots of interesting stories, many fascinating people, a constant sense of being needed, and sometimes the chance to tease others with funny stories about amusing incidents. Yeah. Some people are shocked by this. I mean, there are funny situations like a small amusing incident that happened because of a misunderstanding. I remember once one of the doctors was examining a body with gunshot wounds. Nearby, a few lab technicians and medical registrars were discussing how there were a couple of days off coming up, 2 days off, 3 days off. The doctor only heard part of it and got worried, wondering why there are 3 entrances but only 2 days off. Why are there 2 days off but 3 entrances? Well, what about the downsides of our job? Unfortunately, children also sometimes become victims of crimes. Sometimes murder happens for all sorts of reasons, and sometimes it's neglect, meaning a kind of passive murder. And such accidents do happen. But it's either a fall from a height, like when a child falls out of a window, or when a child pulls a pot of boiling water onto themselves. And for me, this is probably the most emotionally difficult part of the job. Have you become more cynical? Not more cynical, but likely more cold-blooded, less emotional, and perhaps more prone to unpleasant yet philosophical thoughts about events. Being a forensic expert is interesting.